Hell yeah for revolutionary anti-capitalism. Absolutely. They should have picked me for this. My name is Gabby, and I'm an organizer with Lansing GDC, and welcome to the Midwest Anti-Capitalist Conference. I'm just going to do some opening remarks, and then we'll get right down to business with the panel here. I just wanted to say that this conference has been entirely organized and funded by regular working class comrades of the General Defense Committee and our dues. So that means no professionals, no grants, no stipends, or university sponsorship. We believe in the independence of the class to build our own events, institutions, and power. This matters to us, and it matters to the revolutionary movement. We are educating ourselves on how to build popular power. We are not anyone's constituents. We are instruments of our own liberation. So thanks for coming out. And Lindy, it's all you.
Hey everybody, I'm Lindy. I've met a lot of you just running around and saying things about food, but I have some more logistics to go over, so bear with me. Okay, so first, let's give a round of applause for our cooks. And that somewhere between 100 and 300 people, and also make it delicious and make it free, but they worked really hard, and we had tons of hands in that meal, so I hope that you can taste the revolutionary love. And where we are, I just want to say, one, in the incubator kitchen, I'm going to give Bea the floor here in a second, but I also want to acknowledge what land we're on. So we're on the land of the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, Odawe, and last one is Anishinaabe people. And we like to acknowledge that, and the people who stole this land. There are a lot of people and institutions and companies that have taken this land that are here, not in this room, but in this neighborhood right now. And so I won't go down the list, but we can talk to you about that, or give you info on that too. And everything I'm about to say, I think, is in that booklet, but I'm going to just say it just in case it didn't stick. So tomorrow we're going to be at the Freight House, which is about a 10-minute walk from here. It's in an area called Depot Town. We have rides going back and forth. However, if you can walk, we encourage you to do so, just because there's a lot of us and not a bunch of cars, and definitely not enough seats for everybody. We're going to start breakfast at 9 a.m. It's going to be this kind of style. You're going to serve yourself. You're going to do your own dishes. That's important. We're in this together. And right at 10, we're going to start our workshops. We have 2 workshops in the morning, then an hour for lunch, 2 more workshops. And by then, you'll probably hear from me or another comrade to give you logistical information. But on that note, anybody in a GDC shirt is a part of GDC. We have little green cardstock name tags rather than white ones. We can hopefully answer any and all questions that you have. So just flag us. We're wearing these shirts for a reason. So yeah, and nothing is off the table, even if you want to talk politics. And yeah, there is a WhatsApp. The link to that is in the booklet, but if you are going to be coming late to something and you want to be able to have phone numbers of people, again, there's a lot of ways to connect with people to ask questions. Just get connected with it. Last thing is that you are given cups. Bring those everywhere you go. We're going to have water and coffee and other beverages throughout the whole weekend, but we don't want to make a lot of waste. And we just want you to be able to stay hydrated, because it's going to be super hot for Michigan this weekend. So bring those cups. You'll be able to fill them up and wash them just about every location that we go to. Okay, sorry, I have one more thing. There's a code of conduct. Please read it. The whatever too long don't read version is: be a comrade, act in true comradeship. That's what it boils down to, but we do have an outline of what that looks like, just in case something does happen. But we need to support each other, right? If we can't do this weekend, how are we going to do it in the long run, right? So please just give that a read and agree to it in your heart, because we're going to be, wanting to follow that this weekend. Okay, any questions? Ask a GDC person on right now. We're going to do a chant before we get started to bring the energy up. This is going to be a chant that we're going to do throughout the weekend. So we need to get people's attention. Someone's going to scream, high morale. Everyone's going to say, high discipline. And then we're all going to say, let's fight to win. So can we try it out? High morale. Let's fight to win. One more time. High morale. Let's fight to win. Awesome.
Hello. First off, I'm Steve from Lansing GDC. Really want to appreciate everyone that's come out, everyone that's worked to make this happen. Our panelists, some of them traveled from far away to be here today, and we're just really excited that this is happening. I'm here to just give a little bit of background to why we're having this conference, why we thought it was important. So we just came out of a pretty intense period of social crisis in the United States. We saw from 2016 forward, we saw the growth of a massive right-wing fascist social movement. Some of that was carried over to the mainstream political stuff, but what we saw fighting in the streets with fascists on a regular basis. In Kalamazoo here, many of us fought Proud Boys in the streets when they marched through the city. We also saw the George Floyd Rebellion, which was just an unprecedented, massive, multiracial rebellion across the United States that it just had more people than have ever been in motion at the same time, I think, around the world also. And after a month of insurrection, we saw that social movement activism defanged and brought within the confines of the system. There was a lot of marching for months and months and months, but in the end, it kind of just petered out. And all this is on the backdrop of the COVID pandemic. In Detroit, we were hit especially hard, and we saw the racist implications of how the deaths were distributed, and all that period was so intense, and it felt like we were fighting all the time and under siege at times. And it's disturbing how we've kind of gone back to normal, and this is the social antagonism that was so prevalent with every day has now been subsumed. And it's just been talking with Dylan on the way over here, it's just the white folks were unsettled, and the process of getting back to settling and having things settle down back to normal or whatever has been disturbing. And so we feel like this is a time for us to reflect on that period, to come together as comrades and think about the lessons that we gained from all of those years of struggle. And as we see a lot of the movements kind of downturn a little bit and get smaller, we want to rethink what we learned and build a better strategy for a revolutionary anti-capitalist movement here. So yeah, that's it. Really appreciate people coming together. I'm going to go back to the meeting.
Shall we start this panel?
Yeah.
It's me again. Okay, I'm going to introduce our panelists here. So we have Tracy Rosenthal with us. Tracy is the co-founder of the LA Tenants Union, now the largest dues-funded tenants union in the country. Their writings appeared in the New Republic, The Nation, the LA Times, Jewish Currents and Commune. Their book, Abolish Rent, was co-written with their mentor, Leonardo Vilches, and that is forthcoming from Verso Publishing. We also have ML Smith here with us. ML is a criminal punishment system impacted advocate, abolitionist, and activist who experienced incarceration during the COVID-19 pandemic. Her existence within the intersections of being Black, a woman, disabled, systems impacted, and experiencing generational poverty are the foundations of her ideological framework, which is rooted in advocating for those suffering and struggling within a society created, built, and carried out to oppress, marginalize, and dehumanize targeted vulnerable communities. She is the co-director of Missourians, how do you say, Missourians, to abolish the death penalty, or MADP, the founder of Missouri and the founder of the Missouri Justice Coalition, or Mo Justice. We also have Baba Charles here with us. He's an emeritus professor of media and human rights at Marygrove College, Detroit, an emeritus professor of law and journalism at Eastern Michigan University, and additionally, a former faculty of journalism at Howard University School of Communications. Baba Charles was also a member of UHURU in 1962 in Detroit. He is a former member of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and a United Nations / international correspondent for Mohammed Speaks newspaper, where he covered the wars of national liberation in Africa. He's also the founder and co-director of the Hush House Black Community Museum and Leadership Training Institute for Human Rights located in Detroit. And last but not least, we have Dylan Rodriguez, who is a professor in the Department of Black Study and Department of Media and Cultural Studies. He is the co-director of the Center for Ideas in Society. His writing, teaching, and scholarly activism confront the historical regimes of anti-Black and racial colonial violence that are normalized in everyday state, cultural, and social formations, including policing, incarceration, and domestic war. His work raises the question of how insurgent communities of people inhabit oppressive circumstances in ways that enable the collective genius of rebellion, survival, abolition, and radical futurity. Rodriguez is also a founding member of the abolitionist organization Critical Resistance, and he is the author of White Reconstruction, Domestic Warfare, and the Logics of Genocide. And these are our panelists. So please give them a warm welcome.
Okay, we're gonna get started. We have some pre-prepared questions that I'm gonna ask and pretty much go down the line because we want to hear from all of you about everything. But we also hopefully will have time for audience questions. So if something comes up, please wait till the end and we'll make space for that. Okay, so our first question is, what moment, struggle, or condition defines the period in the last 3 years?
I'll accept hazing only from this group. Okay. So the thing I've been obsessed with for the last 3 years in particular is what I would name it as a condition, or I would think about it and name it as the rise of a new phase, a new chapter, and a new set of dangers that in shorthand you can identify as liberal counterinsurgency. I think you all nodding your heads, you see it all around you, you see it in your localities, you see it globally, you see it all over the place. I think the one thing I would urge all of us to do to get our collective minds around how liberal counterinsurgency is working in this moment is to go to the internet and download something called Field Manual 324. It's the US Army and US Marine Corps' official manual on counterinsurgency. They change the title every now and then, but the one considered, it's called Field Manual 324. It used to just be called the Counterinsurgency Manual. But apologies if some of y'all have heard me talk about this before, but around 2006, this thing was rewritten. It was rewritten for the occupation of Afghanistan. And when I read this, I've read this field manual closely, probably 20 times now. The thing that stands out every single time is that it rewrites what I think many people understand counterinsurgency to be. I think in many ways, the imagination of counterinsurgency involves direct forms of violent state repression, as it should. But if you read what the state is now talking about in its strategies of counterinsurgency, it is talking about all of the things that happen in K-12 schools, in philanthropic and nonprofit organizations, in universities, academic research agendas, and sometimes well-meaning gatherings, even like this one, right? And what I mean to say by that is the state understands that the most effective forms of counterinsurgency are those that take place through culture, through pedagogy, through the effective use of symbols and propaganda, through infiltration of people who might be well-meaning social justice warrior types, well-meaning, decolonizing types, well-meaning Black liberation types, but who can be harnessed and brought back into these apparatuses that will ultimately do what? Re-legitimate state power. The whole point of counterinsurgency is to undertake whatever measures are necessary to re-legitimate state power. That's the condition we're in. Throughout the year 2020, you had various arms of uprising across the United States and the world that were directly questioning and actually directly overturning the legitimacy of state power. Not just the police, but the very power of the state. People began to understand that notions like power, freedom, democracy, and safety could no longer be inherently and naturally tied to dependence on either state institutions or even kind of the abstract notion that the state should be the empowered apparatus that creates those things. That fucked with people, including some of the folks involved in the rebellions, right? This is why I think one of the most important lessons that came from places like Minneapolis and Portland, other places where folks were literally burning police stations down, right? Is that the turn toward the defund campaigns, in many cases, was widely acknowledged as a drastic mistake. Why? Because people understood that they went from insurrection to then being tied into boring ass bureaucratic conversations with state officials doing their best to try to reduce funding, to these genocidal warriors of asymmetrical domestic war police. So if we look at what the state has been planning for many, many years, if we understand the way it conceptualized counterinsurgency, we should not be surprised that the liberal arm of the state and apparatuses beyond the state, like I said, philanthropy, universities, et cetera, we should not be surprised that those are the avant-garde of current counterinsurgency. That is the position that we're in, that is the condition we inhabit. And I'm with you in trying to figure out ways to both expose that and to foster various forms of insurrection against it. That's my thought.
Good evening, brothers and sisters, family. I'm Brother Charles. I'm 81 years old. I heard a young lady who said she was 45. Because she's the oldest person in the room. I was so glad to hear Lindy acknowledge where we're standing and sitting right now in this, on top of the genocide that's taken place throughout this country. So wherever you're standing or sitting on this continent throughout the Americas, we're all standing on some genocide from the past that continues. I put down about a dozen things that I thought were very important to me in the past few years. Generally, for shorthand, it's the deepening and broadening of the whole imperialist and the racialized capitalist system. All the negative things that we could imagine and more have been done and are continuing to get worse under the system. Every time I think that I've seen the worst, the next day I see something worse. It just continually gets worse. On the other hand, I'm inspired by the rise in the consciousness of young people and the resistance that's going on to challenge the decadence of the imperialist capitalist system. So I'm inspired by that. I was in Cuba with a wonderful group of young people here in Nipsey. And I was really inspired because I hadn't been to Cuba in 60 years, since the early days of the revolution. And I could see that in spite of the blockade, which is a genocidal attempt to destroy the revolution and hold the island itself. But in spite of that, there was a courageous and creative movement, a heartfelt movement of people to say and take a stand in the way that my grandparents used to say in Georgia, in the country, under the fascist system of apartheid in North America, that we have to make a way out of no way. Make a way out of no way. They are doing the impossible. And we are confronted with impossible forces of injustice on every front. In spite of that, little people historically and universally stand up and do the impossible. And so although we are confronted with injustices that we cannot imagine, we stand up and just continue to make a way out of no way and find a way to make a better world, a better society. And we'll change the son of a bitch, that's all.
So I was thinking, of course, what Dylan and Barbara Charles said, right, exactly correct. When I think about these last several years, especially, something really simple comes to me, and it's look squirrel. So when I say look squirrel, I mean that all of the issues that are serious that's going on, from climate change, et cetera, our media, our government, they always distract us, right, with something else. We're having climate disasters. What Beyonce do today. And all of these things that are actually happening every single day, we are so distracted and so embedded with that propaganda and fall for it that we cannot actually see what's actually being done to us. Lately, of course, we've had the heat wave and it's been really hot. Our climate is shifting. In the next 30 years, I don't know if we want to be here, right? There is a book called Endgame. The guy wrote his name, Jared Jensen. And he talks about what are we willing to do to actually save our climate? Are we willing to go through a collapse of our civilization, or are we going to put the capitalists and the global elite in their place and stop what they're doing to us? And so I think that most of us are so indoctrinated with that, we are not actually trying to fight or understand that these people it is a genocide, they are trying to kill us. But we rather, and I mean, I fall into it too, right? You see something on TV, a celebrity, something funny happens, and we all get to talking about it. So I'm not excusing myself in that at all. But I do also understand that the propaganda that we are faced with, way too many of us fall into it every single day, and we're not actually looking at what's the problem. Then we get to blaming each other. Poor people, marginalized people blame each other for what's going on, and we serve as a buffer class from the elites. And so I think that over these last several years, especially since the COVID lockdowns happened, and when people came out of that, it was very much a situation where we need to get back to where we were even more. So let's make sure that we're having fun and, we're doing the things that get, our lives getting, back to a place where they're normal, working, et cetera. But somewhere in Australia recently, like 100 whales just beached themselves and died. We are going through something in this nation, in this country, in this world that in a minute we're not going to be able to come back from. But I just feel like one day we're all going to wake up and there's going to be some apocalyptic event. And fighting capitalism and actually understanding what these people, what these global elite, what these capitalists, what they're doing every single day, what the politicians are doing, because they're helping. Biden always approving some new drilling, program or whatever. So what the politicians are doing, until we actually recognize that they are literally trying to kill us just so they can make more money, and we address that, I just don't see a great hope for our continued survival. So that's what I would say.
Are we going to be at like an experimental concert? Well, now my mind is racing and I already tried to re-prepare this a bunch of times. But so I'm going to speak from the position of an organizer in the student movement. And also during the last 3 years, my personal life went through an upheaval. I moved from the Los Angeles Tenant Union, where I was a member since its founding in 2015, back to where I'm from, which is New York City, and am now a member of Tenant Union Flatbush. So if I switch between these two places, it's only because the 3 years that are under discussion are also a different 3 years for where I've been organizing and thinking. But is there an echo or am I good? I feel crazy, but I think it's fine. There's an echo and it's horrible. It feels like people seem in pain in a way that I don't like, and I didn't say anything that bad. No, you're good. Hello. Oh, good. I was like, I'm today. Okay. So I think from that position, I feel like what, what in the tenant movement we faced in the last 3 years. Like first, with the pandemic, for which the prescription was staying in your homes, right? And the exposure of the foundation of having a place to stay, having a place to be, and having a community as sort of the essential like features of one's survival. And so that was the reality that we faced, you know, like in at the beginning of the shutdowns that were caused by the pandemic. And what we saw in that time, as you were saying, is like the crisis of the legitimacy of the state to provide for people in the context where they could not pay their rent or they did not have anywhere to isolate outside. And in that crisis of legitimacy, to continue to use your words, which I really appreciate, more and more people found themselves organizing, or more and more people found themselves on strike or on a strike of necessity. People simply could not pay. So the movement itself had to undergo a process of recognition that a strike could be something more than withholding. That you could, with a building that could not pay, re-signify that inability into a strike. And I think that was a major transformation in the Los Angeles Tenants Union, who in April of 2020, our members were on rent strike because they could not pay. And it was under the banner of food, not rent. So the prioritization of our basic survival over our landlord's profits. And then in order to reinstate its legitimacy, what we experienced in the tenant movement was what I think of as a massive federal disorganization strategy, which was a subsidy program that individual tenants could apply for. So it was extremely successful at disorganizing the organizations that had happened in the name of cancel rent, that was a rallying cry for people. And then what we saw too, you know, as the pandemic moved on, was the intersection of like how tenant organizing is the intersection of every crisis of our time. It is the crisis of care work that people experience where they're doing a second shift at their at home because they're caring for a loved one. It's also the crisis, the produced crisis of crime, and I put that in quotes because crime is the catachresis that the liberals used to well, that's another story, but I think it's really, for us, it was in the context of the pandemic, it was understanding what it is that the tenant movement does is it produces relationships between people who share space, and that those relationships are the tools that we have, they're the material that we have to get rid of the police. And that was one of the lessons that we were trying to teach ourselves in the context of the pandemic. And now what we're seeing is in other ways that the state is trying to reclaim its legitimacy. And this is in particular in Los Angeles and New York, is because according, the eviction moratoriums could not go on forever. This was the logic. And rent had to be collected. And so what we're seeing from these liberal cities is a combination of good cause eviction protections being substituted for preventing people from getting kicked out of their homes. So the eviction, the restarting of the eviction clock that is a machine to move people from housing to being unhoused. That was restarted, and in its and that process was celebrated in these liberal cities as a transition to better forms of eviction. So the kind of incorporation of good cause right? There's a good cause to make someone homeless. There's a good cause to pick someone up. And then at the same time, the kind of, in these same places, as more and more people were more and more people are and will become unhoused, is the marketing of jails as shelters. And so what we're seeing also in the tenant movement is new forms of incarceration that they're calling housing. And we need to know that for, a tenant for us is anyone who doesn't control their own housing, or that of anyone, or that of anyone else. It's somebody who inhabits but doesn't own. And these are people who rent, or these are people who live outside. These are incarcerated people. This is a broad category of people that I'm talking about. And I think it's really important for us to know what the state is calling housing while it is reestablishing the means to expel people from what you and I might call it by that name. And I'll just stop talking because I think I could go on for like a while. I'm sorry. Yeah, we want me to go on forever if we have the time.
Thank you all for that. Very different, or unique, but very important answers. The next question that we have, feel free to expand on, that conditioned struggle or moment that you shared about, or do something new, but it is, what are the key lessons from the struggles over the past 3 years? So that resistance to what you just discussed or something else, what have you learned from that?
I'll be quick with this one. I think there's a variety of struggles. I think one thing that I will say to frame my comments is the last 3 years have further pushed me to think alongside other people about how we understand movement and struggle in the first place. That what I think we're kind of inundated with in a kind of liberal collective imaginary and a national imaginary as being appropriate forms of movement, which are generally mass in format, which generally orbit around compulsory nonviolence, which disavow particular forms of militancy, particular forms of confrontation, that all those things are not only inadequate, but they're actually dangerous. So I think to allow for movement and struggle to remain trapped, shamed by that limited liberal, pacifist, nonviolent, compulsory nonviolent imaginary is actually undermining the capacity, the desire, and the imagination to engage in forms of abolitionist, liberationist, anti-colonial, revolutionary, or at least proto-revolutionary movement that are already available all the time and they're actually happening. That folks are undertaking, at sites of incarceration, including jails and prisons, but not limited to jails and prisons, and are undertaking through this kind of domesticated label that people have put on things. How people have been calling it mutual aid over the last 3 years, right? Although some of the most radical and militant practitioners of autonomous power that are doing the things that are called mutual aid will only use mutual aid as an almost sarcastic reference to what they're actually doing, which is enacting forms of community autonomy, infrastructure, and self-reproduction that obsolete the state, that demystify the asymmetric, proto-genocidal and actually genocidal effects of police power and state power in that locality. Anyway, I could go on about this, but my point is that I think that the lessons I've taken from the last 3 years is the need to constantly and collectively rethink and collectively analyze what we understand movement and struggle to actually be. That we have to be thinking about that all the time and not allow kind of dominant liberal national narratives and imaginaries to track the way that we think about struggle and movement.
I'd like to focus on the labor movement, of which I had been a part. I grew up in a family where my grandfather was actually involved in the labor movement in Detroit in the United Auto Workers before it was legal. because the unions, the UAW didn't become legal until 1941. And I remember him dressing in the morning. My grandparents raised me, so he would put on his clothes and his pistol because they would have to accompany hired gangsters to assassinate the workers, the labor leaders, and the rank and file, and they would either beat them up or shoot them or they would disappear. So the men who I grew up around, my father, uncles, and grandfather, I mean, they all worked in the factory, and they all packed pistols. And I'm talking about people in the, we attended the church. All the deacons had pistols for the work, for the church and the work. But there was something that unified them, that it had a character, the union movement had a character of family. We went to summer camp as the children went to the labor union camp. We had picnics. There was a lot of to and fro, and this was a multiracial, even during the period of segregation, there was a multiracial relationship developing at the grassroots level. The factory itself was extremely hard work. I mean, before the union existed, if you got your hand cut off on a machine, they just wipe the blood off and put somebody else. You had no benefits until the New Deal, which the workers forced on the president. You didn't know when you would get hired. You didn't know when you were going to get paid. You didn't know how much you're going to get paid. There was no health benefits. There was no retirement. You just worked until you dropped, basically. So it's important to know where the unions, the importance of labor organizing and what they can do. So I saw over the past few years with this rising gap between rich and workers, of the strength, the lopsided strength of the corporations and the absolute weakness of the workers. Now, I was just listening today to economist Wolf talking about, he gave an example. One company hired an actor to play the role of a priest at the company and take confessions from the workers. And then they report back to the company what the workers told. So there's no low that you can even imagine. If there's no, how low can they go? We don't know. It's impossible. But at the same time, there's a rise in the strikes, in the union organizing that's taking place right now. And that's a very positive thing. And another positive thing about it is that the leadership is different than the old leadership. In Detroit, the leadership in the unions was generally white, skilled laborers. So they were an elite among the working class. Although we made tremendous amount of money in Detroit among unskilled workers, because you can imagine people coming directly off the plantations where they might have made $10 a year if they were lucky. Usually the company owned the town you lived in, you had to buy everything from the company, and you would end up in debt. Very much like on the international level with the countries of the global South, you get poorer and poorer. But the leadership now, as I see in the news, they're people of color, they're women. And so they have something, they got something at stake personally about the winning or losing these battles. And I believe that that's going to make a qualitative difference in the composition of the unions. And one of the weaknesses of the labor organizers was that they did not adopt the communities where they lived to lift up the communities. They were focusing exclusively on the shop, getting more money for the people working in that plant or better conditions for the people in the plant. But that's not sufficient for social change. The workers have to be concerned about the people in that community and lifting them up. Whatever is happening in the community, the unions have the strength to fight it on behalf of the workers in the community. And so I'm hopeful that that is going to be a new direction of a labor movement. A second thing is that I saw the weakness of the progressive forces in the country. too divided and often over petty issues. The environmentalists are not working with the labor people. Folks dealing with the abolition of prison movement are not working with the folks in housing and so on. That has to change in order to build a national movement to change the country. We've got to, the people on the left or progressive folks in social justice, we've got to work together. We've got to work together. In Michigan, we have to work together better throughout the state. And that may be true in other states, I don't know. But the composition is different everywhere. But the people who are living in small towns are more isolated compared to the folks in the big cities. And so we have to work, the folks in the big cities, we have to work together with the people in the small towns. We got to think about ourselves as a family from coast to coast. Forget about these boundaries, state lines, county lines, all this stuff. We're all one people and we've got to fight together. So we've got to think about how we work together better. And so I'll come back to that.
So I am going to talk about my work and talking about the lessons that I've learned. I started at Missourians to abolish the death penalty about 3 years ago as an organizer. And at that time, I knew that the death penalty existed. I understood the cruelty of it. But when I started in 2020, later that year on into 21, I saw that the bloodlust, the need to inflict trauma, and the need to murder marginalized people has not waned over these centuries or these decades. That the people who were called, masters and overseers of centuries ago, they were in suits and, they are leading companies, or they are in our government, but they are the same people who have just again, a bloodthirst. This year, not this year, starting last November, for 10 weeks, 3 people were executed in my state. And these were people that I was very close with, but not only I was close with them, they were people who you could tell that our governor and our attorney general really just wanted them dead. One person was actually innocent. Another person had killed a policeman when he was 19 years old because he suffered a tremendous trauma in that moment. And then the third person was the first trans person that's executed in this country. And even in that particular case, Amber had so much trauma in her life. And those particular people could have been spared, especially the person who was innocent. But our government literally said, no, we are going to murder them. They're going to die. So I just had that thrown in my face that no matter what trauma, what abuse, what mental illness anybody has, these people are the same people from 400 years ago. They want nothing more than control and to kill and murder Black and other poor people. And so that's really one of the lessons I learned. And even before that happened with those 3 people I was close with at the end of 2020, going into 21, the Trump administration executed 13 people within probably 7 months time. The last person that was executed on MLK's birthday, January 15th of 2021. And Trump knew that he was coming out the office, and he and his attorney general, they decided that they wanted, to go out with a bang. And they actually did a lot of, constitutionally violated a lot of people's constitutional rights in setting those execution dates and killing those 13 people. But again, it was a bloodlust. So I was really shown that no matter our technological advancements, no matter, people say, oh, we're in the 21st century, we're civilized, all the things, cars, and et cetera, all the things that we have today that has a veneer of civilization. When we go, underneath the surface, we see that these people are still as bloodthirsty, as murderous, as colonizing as they were several centuries ago. And I think that most of us don't realize that, and that's why we navigate our everyday lives, basically thinking everything is okay, but it's not. These people can literally kill you just when they feel like it, and so I think that, these last several years really taught me that there is no coming to any kind of agreement or, compromise with these people. They are out to murder and kill and genocide us. So I think that's what I've learned.
Yeah, I wanted to, I'm gonna quote, my 3 lessons are gonna be pulled from collective lessons that came from the Los Angeles Tenant Union's 2022 naming the moment process, which was a collective process of, took probably a year. There were dozens of interviews, hundreds of people involved in the process of synthesizing these lessons. But I guess maybe just to pull out 1 second is like, the main lesson that I think that we should remember from these last three years is that people can engage in direct class struggle through organizations, and people together can do what alone they cannot. And that when we maintain this as the, I have a mentor who says, it's not when we fight, we win, it's when we don't fight, we lose. And so like the context that I was in, I saw people get rent canceled. I saw people get repairs. I saw people get their tents left alone. I saw Soho burn. I saw people do things together that alone they could not have done, to stay in their homes, to take over public space. And I just think that for me, the mechanism the mechanism through which that was done was the tenant union. And so when I'm reflecting on that naming the moment process, which was, it came at like the annual, although it takes a lot of work, so sometimes we don't do it every year, process of reflection where we say, what did we learn together as a we? That process involves interviewing individual members in their in their tenants associations, in their homes, to say like, what are you doing to build power? Like, how are you doing what you're doing? And from those interviews and from a 2-day gathering of 750 of our mostly monolingual Spanish speaking working class members, what came out was these 4, so I'm adding one, it's 4 lessons, which is building relationships as security, right? Like the material that you have is actually your relationships to other people. That's the source of the power. That's the source of power in our tenant movement, right? It's the relationships that we have, and the decisions that we make collectively to take an economic risk, like withholding rent, to take direct action, like showing up at your landlord's door, like that's the material. Then learning together for empowerment, right? This is like when we do something and we reflect on it, that's how we learn, right? We're not necessarily reading, although reading is involved, but this process of ongoing reflection that, like when you interact with the world, like that is a collective process. Women organizing community defense, that is a way of naming the fact that the work of the tenant movement is feminist work. It is about reclaiming the space of the home and the space of survival. And in the Los Angeles Tenant Union, that work is carried out by women who have to, in some ways, defend their right and their ability to do that work while doing all forms of other work. And then lastly, reclaiming space. So our movement has a territorial imperative to preserve the spaces where we live that are being re-territorialized by capital in incredibly aggressive ways to remove us from place. And so those are the four, like when I think of like, what are the lessons, I think of our lessons, right? Like, how are we as a movement going to move forward? And naming, for me, it's like trying to share these strategies, which you can go on our website and look at the Naming the Moment handbook. It's really beautiful. And think about how you might leverage them in your organizations, because like the idea, you know, one thing that came out of Naming the Moment was this line that one of our members said, which is like, if you don't name something, how are you gonna tell other people that's what you're like? How is it gonna spread? So that's the idea.
Thank you for that. That's what we're doing right now, I think, right? We're naming the moment. And on that note, we're gonna actually pivot towards the discussion of where we are now. I might also pivot the order of the panel, if that's okay. Okay, so the next question, now thinking where we are, what are the key conflicts in organizing we should orient towards to build a revolutionary anti-capitalist movement? And in other words, what should our strategic priorities be?
You want me to start? Okay. Are you sick of hearing from me? I'm really sorry. Okay, well, I mean, obviously that was fishing for compliments. What a rude thing to do to you. I'm so sorry. I'm just gonna give, I'll make this brief then, but you know, like I'm a partisan of a particular movement, right? But I can give, and I'll give an abstract defense of it, and I'll give a concrete one. The abstract defense of organizing tenants in the phase of like in the conjuncture that we're in right now would be would come from where wealth is. And so 65% of the world's wealth is held in real estate, and 75% of that is in housing. And as probably many of you know, we are like, capitalists are becoming less and less interested in making money via the production of things. They are increasingly switching their schemes to produce wealth via speculation, particularly in real estate. So this is an ongoing process of consolidation that is happening at the level of capitalist organization, and makes tenant organizing an arguably key site in intervening in that process where we're at now, right? That's the abstract defense. The concrete one is we need some place to be, and we need some place to get together. And I know that that is becoming harder and harder for me and everyone I love. And I imagine that that is true for you too. And if we're gonna do the work that we need to do to make another world, we're gonna do that by giving ourselves space to do that. And I think for me, right, the tenant organizing is a way of claiming space as a right. It's a way of making a space where people can be and where we can be together. And when we get together, well, that's how anything gets done. So.
Hello. So as far as what was you know, I believe that everything that is going on today boils down to a class struggle. And way too many people don't understand what capitalism is. I've had people tell me because they go to a job and make $14 an hour and they bought them a PS5, they're a capitalist. And so really, the education will always be a priority, but really educating people about what these class struggles are, and not just what the class struggle is, but the people at the top, what they are gaining and what we are losing. And so I really think that we have to get to a place where we have those conversations, where we take the people we love, the entertainers and the artists and the musicians, because we can defend them all day, right? And understand that they are in a certain position and their interests do not align with ours. Several years ago, a couple of rappers decided they were going to vote for Trump. And it was a whole big issue. But the thing is, their tax brackets requires that they voted for Trump, because that's what he was trying to do, to make sure that rich people got what they needed. And so having those types of conversations and understanding that we really need to instill in people these differences and these, what it actually means. And I'm going to throw out a book. Recently, a person I admire a lot named Dr. Jared Ball, he just wrote the second edition of The Myth of Black Buying Power. And amazing read. And so many people push back on him, but we have to understand that buying power doesn't exist. We're in debt, right? What you're buying, you are going in debt for it. And so I think that we really have to have those conversations about what capitalism is, the class struggle that we're having with the elites, and what it means we're going into more debt, the student loan issue, Medicare for all of the issues that we're dealing with today, they boil down to that class struggle, because the people who argue against it, even the poor people, right? They don't understand. They are, oh, you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You don't even have any bootstraps, right? You don't have any boots. And so I think that those lessons are really not coming across like they should, or it's so much, propaganda out there to where we're not really looking at that and understanding what capitalism really means, what the billionaires are doing, et cetera. We're just wanting to argue with each other. So I really would prefer if we, refocus on what capitalism is and the harm that it's doing. I don't know why people want to claim they're capitalists, because capitalism is harmful. It is exploitative. It is murderous, right? And so actually the reality of what it is, that should be educated, talked about, et cetera. But yeah, I do definitely, and not just Dr. Ball's book, and I know you had talked about everything that Dylan wrote, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. It's an anthology, and Dylan wrote one of the chapters, an amazing anthology, several other people. I don't even know the rest of the people's names, but I remember Dylan wrote his part, and it was amazing. But we really have to understand our fight will not be funded by capitalism, because those are the people who are doing what they're doing to us in the first place. But yes, I really think that those conversations about what capitalism actually is needs to be hammered home.
I want to talk about the racialized capitalism, which is a part of this class struggle. And then sometimes the class issue is a major aspect of the struggle, sometimes race is a major aspect. And in the United States, it's very complicated. I grew up, well, I was about 15 years old before there was desegregation in the United States. So I lived during the apartheid era. And I saw the struggle in the community during the segregation period in the Black community. There was still a certain strength that we had because of the strength of the family and because of the relationship with the church. Whether or not you're a religious person, doesn't matter. The church in the Black community played a role of an alternative existence, which gave you some strength. For instance, if you could be a garbage man in the community, That's your job. But in the church, you were an usher or a member of the choir or a deacon or a trustee, or you had a role that was very significant in that entity, but it went beyond that entity. You were known throughout the community because of your role in the church. And so that gave you they gave you a defense against the injustices on the outside. Now, with the desegregation, we lost that strength because people no longer, the numbers of people no longer go to church, and the families changed dramatically because when I was growing up, it was common to have 3 generations in the same house, as we often do in much of in the countries in the global South, in the villages. Your grandparents were there, or aunts and uncles, your parents, and the children, and sometimes other additional relatives. The street that I grew up on in River Rouge in southwestern Detroit, at least half the people on that street were family. So I was protected throughout the community because everybody in the community knew each other or were related to each other, intermarried with each other, all these sort of relationships that no longer exist. If somebody was, I never even heard of a kidnapping, except there was one national story about the Lindbergh family that I heard. They talked about that for about 20 or 30 years. If somebody got killed, I mean, a murder, they would talk about that for the next 5 or 10 years, one murder. The sexual abuse was going on, but it was in the closet, we didn't know about it. I'm jumping way ahead, since we lost some of those strengths that we had in the earlier period as a need for us to, I always emphasize, we have to think of ourselves as family now. But I had an experience working for Congressman John Conyers back in the 1980s. He was a social democrat, very much like Bernie Sanders. And the Detroit members of Congress at that time had a certain strength that they all grew up in the trade union movement. So, and the unions were strong, so they had some power that didn't exist in many places. I was assigned to work on the Family Farmers Bill around 1985. The family farmers in the rural areas around the United States, in agricultural areas, did not have the protection of the members of Congress in their areas because the members of Congress were bought by the agri-businesses, the big farmers, the corporate farmers. So the little farmers really didn't have any strength at all from the politicians. And at this time, they were going through a major economic crisis. Their land was being foreclosed, their cattle was being taken, everything was being taken from them. They were going through a Great Depression in the 80s. This was also the time of the Rainbow Coalition that Jesse Jackson was running for president, first time. I was appointed to work with the family farmers, and they were mostly white. They're mostly from the rural areas around the country. They were mostly conservative, they were Republicans, some of them were Klansmen. But they didn't have any support from their own leadership. And so the only people who in Washington who were supporting them were the Black Caucus. Imagine that. I attended their meetings. And they were, because one of the things about farmers is they're honest people. If they don't like you, they don't like you. They don't try to pretend. If they like you, they're serious. And when they talk about fighting, they're ready to fight. So very simple, straightforward relationship. Now, mind you, I saw a bumper sticker during that period, when Jesse Jackson was running. The bumper sticker said, "I don't know about you, but I'm voting for the nigger." Shows some of the contradictions of the same people who are fighting on your side, but still have the racism in their hearts. That's a contradiction that we face throughout the country today. In Michigan, Mayor Coleman Young, the first Black mayor here, he issued a call for economic help from around the world, because we were in an economic crisis at that time. We got the farmers upstate who were also right-wing Republicans or Klansmen, they donated something like 50 tons of food to the Black workers in Detroit, in spite of the racism. I was invited to go to their homes and to their organizations, wherever they were around the country. I never did, but I felt that they were sincere. Now in Michigan, we still had the problem that we had then. I was doing the campaign of Trump. I went upstate Michigan, and there was a Black town there called Idlewild, Michigan. It used to be a major resort for Black folk. And surrounding them, there was a lot of working class whites who many are very poor, living in wooded areas around there. They were campers that were broken down campers. Folks are living in the woods and broken down. There's rain coming through the campers they're living in. But they have Trump signs all around the place, Trump flags, Trump clothes, Trump badges, everything with Trump, in spite of the fact that they are being oppressed and in deeper poverty than the Black folks in Detroit. So we have to figure out how we're going to fight racism and at the same time build coalitions and fight imperialism in spite of the racism. And I think that can be done. But we have to figure out the ones who are conscious have to build networks in the places where we don't have contact. For instance, there are cities and towns around the state. The folks are suffering from all the capitalist, negative aspects of capitalism that you know about. We have to build some unity with those folks. And I have seen the possibility of building the unity in spite of the racism. Now, racism is such a deep phenomena in the West, not only in North America, throughout the planet, actually. And so that isn't going to go away, even with a revolution, not by itself. We have to figure out right now how we are, those of us sitting here in this room, what are we going to do to change ourselves to be people ready for a new society? We can't wait for the new society. You're going to wait for the revolution to change, because after the revolution, you'll still be the same person and we'll still be dealing with the same racist issues, gender issues, all that, if we don't do that now. So we got to do the two things simultaneously. We've got to change ourselves, we've got to change the system, and we've got to change our relationships. So don't be afraid to deal with people who are racist. The racism has affected all of us in very negative ways. Many African Americans can't deal with white folks on an issue that's unrelated to race because we don't trust you. But we've got to work together and figure out how we're in a tenants union, for instance. We all have the same objectives in the tenants union or the trade union. And so we've got to build in spite of the racism. And that building actually decreases the distrust. I saw it in the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. We organized Black workers to do wildcat strikes at Dodge, Maine, at Chrysler, at Great Lakes Steel, at Fort Henry Ford. And we were dealing with issues about working conditions. When you get blood, you get blood. I had a piece of steel hit me in the arm, and I ran to the medic. The foreman is running behind me, telling him to come back because we don't want the line to shut down. Well, we walked out. That shut down the plant, but it also benefited white workers. White workers, many of them saw their benefit and they joined with us because they also benefited from that struggle. So some of the struggles have to be organic, that is, in the place where you're fighting, you're dealing with the needs to have relationships with everybody in that entity, whatever it is, whether you're fighting about housing, prisons, whatever it is. When you've got an integrated group, we've got to figure out how to build relationships of trust and figure out who the real enemy is. That is not an easy struggle, but that is an American phenomenon, and I'll say a Western phenomenon that we've got to deal with. And the white, you young people, I see that a major difference in your attitudes I really noticed it with the George Floyd protests, that there were integrated protests everywhere. That's a new phenomenon. It may not be striking to you, but it's really striking to me because in the 60s, we didn't have that much unity of operations, functional unity. And I noticed it on our Cuba trip, among all the different, the diversity of young people, gender diversity, racial diversity, geographical diversity, didn't seem to matter as it used to matter. So this is a step forward, and you have to take advantage of it right now. Do not be afraid to bring it up. And you're gonna make mistakes, you get cussed out, you'll be embarrassed, doesn't matter, just keep fighting. Thank you.
Let me continue by just thanking the three of you for this free seminar, this free masterclass. I've been sitting here taking notes. Yeah, I'm learning a lot. So y'all have brought it up already. So let me just reiterate that we need to have precision when we think about the terms of capitalism, especially if we're using the term racial capitalism. And I say this because I've seen the term racial capitalism circulate a lot over the last decade or so. It is often completely fucked up in how people are actually conceptualizing it, right? Folks are often conceptualizing capitalism as just capitalism with racism added to it. That's not what racial capitalism is. In a sense, we've been talking about racial capitalism for the last hour, almost hour and a half. If you go to the archive of primarily Black radical and revolutionary thinkers who formulated the concept of racial capitalism, sometimes naming it that way, sometimes just calling it capitalism, from Cedric Robinson to C.L.R. James, to Du Bois, to Angela Davis, to Sylvia Wynter, we could go on. What this concept understands is that the colonial and anti-Black violence, the wild genocidal and chattel warfare that happened throughout the different regimes of capitalism are not merely the historical precondition for the creation of capitalism, but they are the constant condition of possibility for capitalism. So the forms of that wild genocidal warfare are constantly changing, but they are constantly at the center of how capitalism works, how it reiterates, how it reproduces, and how, for that matter, creates a kind of antisocial social world around it, right? So make no mistake that when people burn the police station down, that is not merely an anti-state act. That is a strike against one of the kind of pulse points of racial capitalism. This is to say that in answering this question, so I didn't mean to be pedantic like that. I just wanted to like teacher mode for a minute, just because I got beef with the way racial capitalism has been misused, so I just had to get that off my chest. But to answer the question directly, if we're thinking about this point around key points of competent organizing, the Democratic Party is the party of racial capitalism. Can we please reach a collective understanding of how the Democratic Party works as the party of racial capitalism? I think to Jesse Jackson's worst moment, Manning Marable was brilliant at this, right? No, Manning Marable named it. He said Jesse Jackson's one of the, arguably the only major national political figure in the history of the United States that destroyed his own party, right? And him dismantling his own organization is what made Obama possible, right? And Obama is the 21st century personification of how racial capitalism is by way of the Democratic Party. Now I say that in a sense, in this crowd, Obama is an easy target. Other crowds, he wouldn't be. In this crowd, I think he's an easy target. But what I really want to get at in responding to the question that was posed is I think we have to deal with all of the insidious and extended ways that the Democratic Party works to direct and redirect collective energy, including our collective energy in the room. I say this because I have both friendly and kind of intense arguments and debates and even fights with my comrades and collaborators from all over the US, primarily from all over the US, who are constantly trying to fuck with the Democratic Party in some kind of way. Right, whether it's a person from the grassroots movement who's now running for city council under the aegis of the Democratic Party, and now we're going to mobilize around supporting that campaign, and we're going to hold their feet to the fire, and then they fuck it all up. It's happening in Chicago right now, right? I went back and forth with one of my favorite people, Bill Ayers, in Chicago, because he was like pushing that campaign. I love Bill Ayers, right? You know what I mean? Like I like him, but I was yelling at him because he was pushing for, it wasn't just him. It wasn't, it was a bunch of them. I was in a meeting with them. They were all talking about this the new mayor, the person who became mayor of Chicago. And I said, I thought you were revolutionary, Bill. What are you doing? And anyway, so my point being, like, I mean, so you can do it in a kind of good-natured way too, but my point is that the way the Democratic Party works is really, but it's insidious, but it's also in plain view. I don't know how many times I've seen these kind of sound bites on social media and elsewhere of the people who are attributed with being the kind of founders or co-founders of what's come to be known as Black Lives Matter, giving talking points on corporate media channels like MSNBC, which are literally Hillary Clinton talking points, and talking about that as like the legacy and the victory of the uprisings of Black liberation struggle since 2015, really since Oscar Grant. If I'm gonna trace it, but it was from Oscar Grant to Michael Brown to Breonna Taylor and onward. So the way the Democratic Party is working, that's my first answer to the first part of that question. I think we gotta identify this Democratic Party shit, and we have to have a collective and unapologetic opposition to how that stuff works, especially when people are our friends of ours, loved ones of ours, are trying to trot out the idea, well, what do you want, fascism? Well, these are the friendly fascists. Well, we know this. I thought we knew this, but maybe we don't. All right, so there's that. The strategic priority piece. I'll just say this in line with what I just said. Whether or not you are able to actively participate in these kinds of activities, I do think it is at this point a strategic priority to embolden, to defend, and to critically honor all forms of militant insurrection against capital and state power, including so-called failed ones. Right? In the Philippines, Lapu-Lapu and his people beheaded Magellan, right? They beheaded Magellan. His head's still rotting on the beach somewhere. Right? Now, Spanish colonialism still fucking happened. But I dare say that to critically honor the legacy of what Lapu-Lapu and them did to Magellan is meaningful, and perhaps, I'm repeating a poem. This is a poem, I'm not being literal. Perhaps it's guidance.
Yes.
Okay, perhaps if we look at what's been happening in Palestine for the last year or 2 years, of radical militant opposition, counterattacks against the apartheid police, in which young people know they are going to die, right? But have a particular close relationship to martyrdom, in which they embrace the political value of taking police out.
Yeah.
Right? We don't want to talk about this here, do we? Right? But this is what's going down. I think this is what I'm saying this is a strategic priority. Right? I talk about this because it gives me joy to talk about it, obviously, right? But I also think it's a strategic priority that this, especially when there are supposedly failed attempts at insurrection. Nat Turner, right? A cynical view of what Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey and Toussaint Louverture, all these, you could cynically say, oh, well, they failed because bullshit. That's not how this, so let's get out of that calculus of failure and think about how it might be a strategic priority to begin to take more seriously, to be more critically celebratory, right? So I'm not just saying I'm saying we want to have an analysis. We want to be critical. We also want to honor these forms of insurrection. This is the time to do it because as my friends, comrades have talked about, you're in a moment of climate crisis and apocalypse. You're in a moment of constant displacement to the point where to be unhoused is just kind of an accepted state of dying, of living and dying. And we're talking about the conditions of labor are being completely eviscerated, to which labor is now kind of becoming unrecognizable in certain places, right? So that's what I think is a strategic priority.
Thank you for the room. That's needed that. So we have 2 more questions, but I'm going to merge them into one for the sake of time, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. But in GDC, we kind of have this, it's not a super strong tradition, but basically if we're having a report back or someone's bringing something new to the group, et cetera, we ask, what can the larger organization do to support you? It doesn't have to be like a very, send this email. It's like, how are we going to participate in the struggle with you as you do this thing, or how can the organization take that up? So in the spirit of that, what are you asking this group in this weekend or in the coming months to take up, and what is necessary for the movement to carry on? And I'm going to mix it with the other question by, if you want to think of key challenges facing us now, in the context of those key challenges, what are we doing? What should we focus on this weekend and in the coming months? And we can popcorn this one, if you'd like. This is for y'all. Yeah, vote for whatever order you'd like to do.
There are two things on my mind I'd like to talk about. I guess I'll do one right now. One is the lack of education, the necessary education that we need in this country, beginning among activists. You know, there's been a long struggle about Black studies, women's studies, ethnic studies. But all of the social sciences that are taught in the United States lack accuracy, depth, critical thinking. Whatever it is, we're talking about European history, labor history, various movements. I think that it doesn't matter which one you pick. There's a weakness, or the propaganda of history is prevalent, and we have to basically start from scratch, start all over again, studying our history. I had an experience because when I was a child, I remember the soldiers coming from World War II, and the Black soldiers spent most of their time talking about the racism in the military. I remember the soldiers during the Korean War, and I was always wondering, why are we fighting in these places? But I couldn't, it didn't make sense, and I couldn't get into the soldiers because they didn't know why they were fighting in various places. And I had a class in high school my last year in '59, and it was taught by the football coach, and we were talking about the Korean War, and he read it out of the book. I asked the question, why were we fighting in Korea? He said it was because we were fighting for justice and democracy and truth, you know, and all that. And so I accepted that. I was 17. I didn't know anything at all about it. And then I went directly into the Air Force after that. And so I met a lot of the old guys who had fought in World War II and Korea. And they were talking about how they got an ass kicking in Korea. And I told them what I had read that we had won the war, and so they fell out laughing at me. And I was pissed. I said, I've been tricked. And so I started asking GIs, older guys who had been all over the world in all these American wars, why they were there and what they were doing. And their answers always contradicted whatever the official position was. They didn't agree with whatever the government said the reason was. And so that made me realize that I had to start from scratch, because everything I had learned about the foreign policy, domestic policy was wrong. And so I want to encourage you to start learning about the various struggles. I use the book, The People's History of the United States. I think it's still a very important book, because he talks about a variety of struggles in the US and the reasons and the outcome. I think it's very important so that you get the whole rainbow of the struggles here that have taken place. And that's really the beginning of studying American history. Now, he doesn't, as I recall, he doesn't deal with the foreign policy. Now, we have been conditioned to think in the United States that foreign affairs is something for experts, and you're not supposed to get involved in that. Don't even think about it. Don't say nothing about it. That's not for you. It's too complicated. You're not smart enough to deal with that. Let the people in the foreign affairs expertise deal with that. That is totally incorrect. If you can understand how gangs work, the Crips got side, they got the east side, the Bloods got the west side, who got the most guns, they're gonna take some territory. I mean, it's that simple. Now, we've got all kinds of labels and terminology and theories about it, but basically, if you understand gangsterism, that's what foreign policy is. And so, now I was an international fellow in Columbia, but I didn't learn as much as I did from the people who were self-taught, who told me, one of the elders that I worked at the United Nations, he said, son, you can cover anything you want to in New York, but don't go near the waterfront, you'll end up in a cement suit. Well, that was domestic affairs that shows the intricacy, the relationship between the criminality of the political system. It's endemic domestically and globally. So we have to incorporate in all of our activism a consciousness of what is the relationship between what am I doing in the tenants union dealing with housing, the land grabbing in the cities is the same as the land grabbing that took place in the genocide here originally against the Native people. The land grabbing is universal and it's continuous. We come up with all types of different labels for it, but the essence of it is the same. The mentality of the corporations have not changed. Now, our domestic policy changed somewhat after the Civil War. The tactics changed, the war on workers changed the character, but foreign policy never changed. We still have a slave foreign policy. And that's we call it colonialism and neo-colonialism, but it's still the slave mentality that the white settlers have a right to take and rule this planet. And if you get in their way, they'll kill you. That is the rule that was the rule then, is the rule today. So if we have expectations about a nicer foreign policy, that ain't gonna happen unless we change the system. Now, it's important to take one of these struggles at a time. We can't take all of the Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua, we can't, and the Congo and Haiti. There's too many to bite off at one time. But remember, it is the policy of slavery that is universal, international, that is still operational. And so we have to fight, whether we're talking about the gentrification, it's just a modern term for land grabbing, what they did originally. They're doing it in the Congo, in Haiti, and Palestine, whatever you can point on the map. It's land grabbing, it's theft, it's gangsterism. Local, whatever your local issue is, deal with it locally and globally. Show the people the relationships between what they're doing and the health system here is dysfunctional. Explain why can the people, poor folks in Cuba, have a free healthcare system that's one of the best in the world? They're in poverty in Cuba. We're rich. Well, we don't intend to have a health system for the public that's decent. We don't intend. Why is it that we got homeless people in a rich country? We intend to have homelessness. That's a part of the capitalist system. We can tell people in Cuba, the 85% of the population has a family home. Evictions are illegal. But let's tell people what's happening in other places, show the relationships, because that may inspire them to change, to realize I don't have to take that shit. If they can do it in a poor country, in an island, in the Caribbean, we can do it here. Let's fight about this. So with I think that will change the attitude of many people who we think are complacent, because they don't realize that another world is possible and another world exists right now.
Yeah, I think, for me, interrupting that scale of land grabbing happens when you ask your neighbor, what's up where you live? And I would say, just to answer the question concretely and maybe try to give some the next step of this process of, I was thinking about how the LA Tenant Union just sent a contingent to Venezuela to learn about the comunas with where people get resources, building materials, and the authority, the control to produce their own housing and live in it collectively. And then that is being brought back to the movement that we have in LA. But that whole process, the union, you know, like thinking about Venezuela as our neighbors is only possible when we think about like our neighbor, like who lives next door. And if the person who lives next door speaks a different language than you, then that's actually, that's something that you can work out. Like, and that's what I think I wanted to end with too, to say the LA 10 union wouldn't be possible without language justice, without making our meetings bilingual, because it means that relationships are possible. So I would say, ask your neighbor what's going on in their apartment. Ask yourself if it's the same thing that's going on with yours, and ask each other, right? Like, is there anything we think we can do about this? And if I feel like a lot, you know, like from getting to like Venezuela as our neighbor and to a union that makes things possible that weren't possible before, like taking control over the places that we live. Like if a tenant movement, if a tenant is someone who doesn't control their own housing, then the tenant movement is to give us collective control. But that is all really made possible in the concrete step of knocking on a door to someone who like is probably has seen you many times and you've seen many times, but maybe you don't know how much is possible like when you meet each other. That's all.
So the key challenge is for me is what I think it always is when people take abolition, liberation, anti-colonialism, and revolution seriously, which is collective imagination, collective radical imagination beyond the horizons that I think we sometimes presume are the limits of what is possible in terms of both community, in terms of power, in terms of how you exist in the world. So radical imagination is the challenge. And I say that in the most open way possible. Now, in terms of what I ask us to do, I think it's a couple things. One is to proliferate, right? And I say proliferate purposely because it suggests something that's the opposite of centralizing. It suggests something that may not necessarily be the same as trying to build mass movement. It might be about proliferated movement that may or may not take the form of a mass. I think, frankly, that's what is much more dangerous to the existing state and racial capitalist order is proliferation rather than mass centralized movement. Mass centralized movement plays its role. It can shift common sense and popular and public discourse in certain kind of ways. So I'm not criticizing that. I'm not throwing that out. But I am saying that the reason why the US state had to rewrite the counterinsurgents manual was precisely because guerrilla warfare is so effective in undermining and making impossible the actual rule of the state as an occupying force, whether it's domestically or somewhere else. All right. So that's the other piece I would say I would ask us to collectively do, which is maybe a collective kind of thought experiment, which is to think about the political, cultural, artistic work that you do ideally in a collective format with other people within the long tradition of guerrilla warfare. That's what I ask us to do. And to take the concept of guerrilla warfare seriously as a supple, as a nuanced, as an evolving, as a 21st century concept. That of course has deep roots. I say this, you know, as the one way in which I am very proudly identified myself as Filipino is in thinking about the Philippine guerrilla war against US occupation and 400 years of Spanish colonialism, right? Which is an ongoing guerrilla war, right? Like it was actually never pacified, despite what the US government says. And it's in fact, the reason I'm ambivalent about the claiming the Filipino identity is because it's actually the nationalization of Filipino identity that has been used as a weapon against those that are still fighting the ongoing guerrilla war. So guerrilla warfare is actually impossible to destroy. That's the whole point of it. That's why it's so dangerous. I'm also thinking about the long history of our incarcerated loved ones, comrades, you know, ancestors, and even descendants who have waged ongoing guerrilla warfare against the concentrated genocidal logic of jails, prisons, detention centers, and so forth. Right? That's guerrilla war. Right? The Pelican Bay prison strike started in 2011, which went on for several years under the most kind of mind-boggling possible conditions of 24-hour isolated confinement, which were intentionally designed to induce insanity, which are actually have been designated by national organizations of psychologists as a new form of psychological disorder created by state torture. The folks in those conditions organized a massive prison strike that, again, proliferated, to use that term, proliferated around the world, not just the United States. So people in Pelican Bay security housing unit can organize that form of guerrilla warfare against concentrated genocidal state power, then we don't have any excuses. All right. This is also to say, in alliance with what my comrades here have been saying, to honor diasporic Black rebellion against chattel slavery and all of its derivatives. All of that is guerrilla warfare, right? We can kind of think about the whole Black radical revolutionary tradition of guerrilla warfare. LGBTQ+ people's struggles against state and police violence and civil violence, and all the forms of state-sanctioned and legally kind of condoned forms of sexual violence and physiological violence against LGBTQ people's bodies and spirits and souls. That is guerrilla warfare, right? So make no mistake, when I talk about guerrilla warfare, don't get me twisted. I'm not talking about just a bunch of dudes running around with machine guns, right? Although that might be part of it. But I'm saying it is not limited to that, right? That's just one tiny little fraction of what we have. So guerrilla warfare takes many forms. It can take the form of art, of teaching, of armed counterattack, of self-defense, or what we can call, the GDC.
I wanted to piggyback off of Bob Charles real quick when he talked about that book, the People's History of the U.S. and the person who wrote it, Dr. Howard Zinn. And I want to put in your heads the fact that Dr. Howard Zinn was fired from Spelman University. He was teaching Black women the truth and they fired him. And that actually goes into my point. We need to decolonize our minds. The first step in all of these journeys is for you to question everything and actually understand the reality of what's going on. A Black university fired a white professor because he was teaching Black women the truth about this country, right? And I didn't actually know that Dr. Zinn taught at Spelman when I first read the book. I learned that some years ago. So when we, and my point is to really question everything you've been taught, everything that you think really delve into the truth behind these things. I'll go back to like the civil rights era when we talk about Montgomery bus boycotts. There were other boycotts in other cities. Rosa Parks was not the first person to sit on a bus, right? But she was put up as the face of that particular movement. So really understanding who did what came about, et cetera, is the beginning to understand the tricks and the propaganda and the lies that we're told. Because like I said, I never knew that how Dr. Zinn was at that college, but when I think about it, when I think about the fact that most of our HBCUs are there to create a Black misleadership class that will be the buffer between white supremacy and poor Black people. That's just the reality of the situation. So really understand what those things mean, what you've been taught, decolonize your own self. Next, I'll say, and this is actually a challenge, but one of my challenges, a lot of even my people don't like me because when I tell people things like, stop hitting your children, right? Oh, we supposed to discipline. You can discipline somebody without hitting them. So I get even pushed back, and people that argue with me the most are Black women. Black women want to argue with me about the fact that they want to beat their children, but then later on, we're raising dysfunctional, broken people. Frederick Douglass said it's better to raise stronger children than repair broken men, but those lessons have left us. So a lot of times my challenges is really in a space where I have to even call out my own people. I have to call out what we've been taught, and I have to put a face to the issues that we have today in raising our children in what I call slave parenting. And so that will be my other part, and really raise radical revolutionary children. Right? Raise your children to be open, honest, supportive. My son was really big when he was little. He was bigger than all the rest of the kids. I would literally get calls from the teachers all the time. He beating up somebody in his class today, bullying somebody else. like literally every week or so, whoever was getting bullied, my son would beat up the bully. And they would call me, and I'm like, well, I mean, I guess he's supposed to be doing that, right? You're not supposed to be letting him bully. So like really instill those things into your children, but that starts with you, decolonizing yourself, decolonizing your mind, questioning every single thing you've ever been taught. So I want to throw out a couple of names. Of course, Baba Charles said that particular book, The People's History of the U.S. Want to throw out a couple of other names. One is a book called Gerugu. That is an amazing book. Dr. Marimba Ani wrote it, and she's talking about the psychological understanding of where colonizers, where white supremacists came from. Another great book is called The Iceman's Inheritance. There's a white man in Canada named Michael Bradshaw, and he actually wrote about how white people, came out of a time in the Ice Age, et cetera, and how they got to where they are. So really understand these, the histories, et cetera. But The Iceman's Inheritance is an amazing book. Gerugu is an amazing book. So really get into, of course, Blood in My Eye and Revolutionary Suicide. So really take these people and not just read, right? We absorb what you're reading. Take notes. That's why I like books. I like actual books. I write in the margin, I underline stuff, et cetera. I really not try to apply those things. I came home from prison after George Floyd occurred in the riots, the uprising happened. And when I came home, I asked a young person who did a lot of protesting. I said, you ever read George Jackson? And he told me, no. You can't step out in the street doing anything and you ain't read George Jackson. I'm like, well, what were you doing? Just yelling? There was no strategy behind it. So that's really what I really want to talk about, just understanding, of course, with the history, like Baba Charles said, reading, understanding, decolonizing, getting to a place where you're actually mentally in that revolutionary state. You might still be involved in capitalism. We all got to eat, we all got to buy clothes, et cetera. But mentally get yourself to the point where you understand the propaganda that's being thrown at you every day and push back against it. So I'll just leave you all with that. My apologies. I just want to put something out. Today, July the 28th, is 20 years since a man named Joe Amrine was exonerated from death row in my state. Joe was on death row for 17 years for a crime he did not commit. He was innocent. The state tried to kill him to the point where a judge asked the attorney, if we found that he is innocent, you still want us to execute him? And the attorney said, yes, Your Honor. These people literally tried to kill Joe on more than one occasion. And he and his lawyers never gave up and they fought. And Joe's been exonerated 20 years today. And I just want to amplify him because he's still in the fight. He's still supporting us. He comes to speak whenever we ask him to. And he's an amazing, I think he's 68 now. But just that little win, even 20 years ago, means that that person is here and he pours into us. And I just want to put Joe's name in your minds. And of course, Amrine is his last name. And, if you want to read about him, but Joe is a hero and he's a survivor. So just wanted to leave it at that.
We've gone way over time because we started dinner late. If you have questions, you have comments, carry them into the weekend. These folks will be here all weekend. Many of them are hosting workshops on Saturday. So bring that, talk about it with people next to you. We will carry it on. Hi, everybody. Good.